Thank you so much for joining us. We are Chevalier's Books. We are the oldest independent bookstore in Los Angeles. Before we get really started, a quick note for everyone. Please make sure that your microphones are muted. You'll have a chance to unmute yourself a little later on if you want to ask any questions. But until then, go ahead, drop your questions into the chat box. That's also where you're going to find a link online to get the book Family in Six Tones. We're also actually working on getting some signed copies, so stay tuned for that, and you can always email us at chevaliersbooks@gmail.com. All right, so let's get really started now. I am so excited for tonight because we have a really stellar cast of people. First off, I'd like to introduce Robert Olen Butler, who has a very extensive resume that includes 16 novels and 4 collections of short stories. And in addition to winning the Pulitzer Prize for A Good Sense from a Strange Mountain, he has also won a Guggenheim Fellowship and the F. Scott Fitzgerald Award for Outstanding Achievement in American Literature. And tonight, he'll do us the real honor of interviewing our main stars, Lan Cao and Harlan Margaret Van Cao, for their co-authored memoir, Family in Six Tones. Some of you may already know Lan Cao is the author of the novels The Lotus and the Storm, as well as the phenomenal Monkey's Bridge, which was actually also an exploration of a mother and daughter living two different mirrored struggles in two countries. And 22 years after that publication, Lan Cao has now published a memoir together with her own daughter, Harlan, who just started, or who will be starting UCLA in about a week, so make sure to wish her luck. And they're going to talk about their dual experiences, which I'm really, really ready to dig into. Please give a very warm welcome to these amazing writers.
Oh, Nancy.
That's what you call virtual warmth, which is wonderful. Yes, thank you.
Do you want to pin him? No.
So, is it time for me to?
Yeah, it's you, Bob.
Me? All right. Well, it actually is my honor to be here tonight. The memoir was extraordinary, and I knew what an amazing writer Lan Cao is, but Harlan, my goodness, you may follow in your mother's footsteps. So now the book is wonderfully innovative in concept and structure. So I guess the first question I would have for you, tell us all how it came about. Yes, I'll let you, why don't you start, Lan, because it probably came through you first, but I want to hear from both of you on the ways you engaged this.
I think that it's somewhat of a reversal of the usual order because the book sort of landed on our lap, the idea for it. So when Harlan was 12, so that would be what, 2014? Mm-hmm. Yeah, 2014. We did an interview, but it was more for the archives. It was an interview with First Days, I think, First Days on NPR. And it was just about first days of refugees from Vietnam, oral history. And it was just archived and nothing came of it. Then suddenly in 2018, which is the 50th anniversary of the Tet Offensive, which was so startling to me because I think of the Tet Offensive as something that just happened. But 50 years after the Tet Offensive, so 2018, StoryCorps approached us and said, we would like to take out a snippet of that longer interview that you did when in 2012 and just bracket the part that dealt with the Tet Offensive, and we would like to play it. And the way the first interview was structured, the original one, was the daughter asking the mother question, or in our case it was mother-daughter, but it could be, parent-child. And so it played on Morning Edition on NPR, and our editors at Viking heard it. And, you know, I call her my editor, but she's my dear friend now because we've worked together since '97. So Carol heard it, and I think some other people at Viking heard it and approached us to do a mother-daughter memoir, which is unique in its format, because not only is it dual voice, but I think the idea is that the child is actually talking about the mother-daughter experience like right now, not when the child is more grown up and reflecting into the past about the relationship with the parent. So that makes it quite different from other mother-daughter's relationship books.
Yeah, and it's surprising because I think I was way less nervous to do it than she was, when I feel like it would have been the opposite normally. But I think just because our personalities are so different, I've always been pretty extroverted, and I've never minded to share anything about myself. Sometimes it would be too much. And she was the opposite, because she was so used to writing things in fiction. So even if parts of it were kind of autobiographical, she could at least say like, oh, it's a different character, or it's this or that. But especially being 15 when I first started it, I'm thinking like a memoir is something that you write at the end of your life when you're looking back, not the end, sorry, like, but like when you've done stuff. And I was just like in the middle of high school, so I'm thinking like, what could I possibly have to write about? So I felt, I mean, I'm already self-conscious just because of who I am as like my age and everything, and being a girl. And then on top of it, like I'm gonna write about my life, which I didn't feel like I deserved it at the time when I was offered it. And then it's even weirder because then you have to do it with your mom, about your mom, and then she reads it right after. So it was very unusual, but I'm very grateful for the opportunity.
Yeah, unusual, and to your credit for both of you, quite candid. That's the extraordinary thing about this. You know from the first words of the book that this is a truth-telling book. And that's one of the things that makes it so really special and enduring. So Lon, let me ask you a question. I'd like you to talk about the two literary forms that you've worked in so splendidly, the novel and the memoir. By the way, I hasten to add, the splendidness of your work in the memoir is fully aided, abetted, and indeed enhanced by Harlan sitting next to you there. But you know, this is you have the gift for that as well. So I want you, if you will, if you can explore the phenomenon of this writing duality. Can you address the differences, the challenges in working in each of these two prose forms, how they connect, and how they there needs to be a sturdy wall between them in certain ways. Can you talk about process in the two forms, and how they collide and how they enhance?
Okay. So for me, my two prior books that are not or two prior writing that's not legal scholarship were naturally for me in the fiction format. And I just feel much more, maybe because of my personality, because as Harlan mentioned, I'm much more of an introvert and private. And so the memoir feels extremely like an unveiling process. And there are things that are, that both forms do have elements in common. I think one would be, there's prose. I mean, I think you should have good prose, obviously, in both forms. There are themes. I mean, even though this is a memoir, it's not an autobiography, so it's not as if I'm just going chronologically and including everything in the kitchen sink. When we spoke with my editors, it was very clear that they wanted a book, and I agreed with them, that revolves around stories of war and loss and betrayal. And also maybe, of course, migration and the process of assimilation, which is something that I think has been a haunting element for me since '75. So, you know, themes are also in the memoir. It's not just everything that has ever happened in your life. There's narrative. You know, you want the book to have a forward momentum in both novel, in both fiction and memoir. And character, right? There's character development as well. It's a journey. It's like the Odyssey, right? That's a universal process. It's a journey of the two characters, how they began, where they began, and where they think they're ending up. So those are very common themes, common elements. But for me, when I wrote the memoir, I felt much more aware of who the reader is going to be. And I never really felt that as much when I did fiction. And maybe it's because there are more layers between the writer and the reader. You know, both forms of writing, of course, is solitary because you're writing by yourself. It's not like you're an actor in the theater where you see the audience right away. You're usually just writing by yourself, and then somebody will hopefully eventually read it. But for the novel, I really didn't think much about the audience. For the memoir, I really did, and that was problematic for me because I often felt like, who is the audience? Is it for the American audience, or is it for the Vietnamese community, the refugee diaspora, or is it for the Vietnamese in Vietnam? And I think that for minority writers, or even women writers, I put those in quotes because I like to just think of writers, but there is such a thing as, you know, let's say an Asian American writer, right? Sometimes, and especially Vietnamese writer, because there are so many conceptions about Vietnam. So I often feel like when I wrote this memoir, and if I think I'm writing for the American readership, what position do I take? Do I take the position of, I'm not going to explain anything at all, right? I'm going to take the position of the majority writer, which is not to explain anything and just assume the reader knows what you're talking about. And exert a very strong authorial voice, which I often think of as, if you translate it into just the non-writing world, it's more like the male voice, which is very used to just saying and then have somebody try to understand. But I feel like, and this could be problematic, I'm not saying that this is the right way to be, but when I wrote the memoir and I thought, for whom am I writing? I felt like I was writing for both the Vietnamese and the American. And if you're writing for Americans, you have to explain more and there's more translation. There's a debate among, you know, minority writers about which position to take. Just not explain and have them go look. And if they're lost, so be it. I guess because I'm Asian and female, I'm just much more relational. So when I'm writing, I want to explain and I want to make the bridge. And I want to be able to communicate. That may be the curse of being a female writer, very concerned about the reader. But I know that many male writers who are friends of mine really reject that position. Like, just write as if you're the majority and don't explain a thing. Just assume everybody knows where you're coming from. So that was a struggle for me. And how much to reveal is also, because I'm a very private person. You haven't written that.
Yeah, and let me ask Harlan as kind of a similar specific question, unless you have something you really want to say about the two forms, because you haven't been working.
Yeah, I have no idea, no.
You, Harlan, wrote wonderfully about your time in Vietnam. First in 2009, that visit when you were there in the summer, where you put in a Vietnamese school, and then later on in 2017, with your mom and a group of friends. Then you also wrote about the Vietnamese community in Virginia and in California. So just as your mother, I was interested in the duality of process for someone both novelist and memoirist. I'm interested in a duality of yours. You've been immersed in the Vietnamese culture in many ways, and you are also quite clearly, innately American. So how did that cultural duality, the felt difference in the two cultures all through your life, how did that affect you? How did it shape your view of the world?
Well, to address like the trips where I went to Vietnam, obviously when I was 6, going to Vietnam meant a lot to me just because it becomes real, and I would see like exactly where my mom came from. So obviously that makes me feel closer to her already. But going to Vietnam, to me, it's not something where I go and it's like this washing over of like, this is where I belong, like this is the place of my people. But I always say, like, obviously if I had a choice between like saving Bangladesh or Vietnam, I'd be like, okay, I'll save Vietnam. So I obviously care about it a lot. But I mean, like with the culture, I definitely think having both meant that I was exposed to like the ways of the world, but also I feel very safe. Like my mom, because of where she came from and everything she went through, she developed a mindset where she wanted to show me a lot of things that could go wrong, but still wanted to keep me safe, like in a snow globe. And I always use that analogy when I write, just because I always struggled with like, am I inside the snow globe or am I outside the snow globe? And I decided I think I'm inside the snow globe, meaning that my bubble is very safe. It's still an interesting bubble, but I can still see outside and I kind of just like roll around. And am I answering the question correctly?
Yeah, you are, absolutely.
Okay. And I think also I learned a lot about respect and just being conscious of everyone else's space, everyone else's needs. And, my Vietnamese family, we are very, everyone's pretty high functioning. Like everybody, you can tell they've been through a lot of trauma, but they don't really talk about it that much. And I think it's just because as they grew in their careers, like they figured they didn't really have to, and they all internalized it. Whereas with my mother, I think she's the exception because, she writes about it openly. I mean, obviously in the novel form, so not autobiographically, but her personality that came out of Vietnam, I think definitely benefited me growing up. I mean, obviously in the book, there's parts where I complain about her, but
Yeah.
but I still think, I still, and I also don't want it to seem like I think of myself as like divided between two cultures, because I've never felt that way at all. I was always close to my dad, always close to my mom. We spent just the right amount of time in the Vietnamese community going to Vietnam. I've obviously I want to go back, but I've never felt a divide at all. Any divide that I ever felt was more so just like typical, I guess, like teenage girl stuff. It was never because of this culture. I've always appreciated, I think, having two.
And by the way, for those who are here and have not yet read the book, they may not know when you refer to your dad is a Westerner, American.
Yes.
So yes, the duality lives within you. Now you kind of made a kind of diminishing reference. In fact, and it's a aspect of the book because it speaks to, first of all, it speaks to your guys' relationship, that you can be this honest about each other and work your way through. But there is a great deal of friction chronicled between the two of you in the book. And so in answering this question, perhaps you might want to think of finding this part of your life in that, again, in a kind of duality. This seems to be the motif, that although a lot of the friction was during this time, see if there isn't something that you can find in talking about your experiences here that really led that where you might have been able eventually to find an empathetic common ground. I'm talking about high school. Now that's a tumultuous time in anyone's growing up, and both of you address your high school years. And so I'd like each of you to address the essential struggles of that time. So in answering that, I want you to be alert to those shaping similarities. And how did your school years also shape your perceptions of each other then? And Lon, why don't you start?
Okay. You know, I'm still astounded that it's very hard for me to talk about high school, but I will, because it's in the book. So of course I'll talk about it. You know, we were the first waves of refugees from Vietnam who came, because the refugees who came in different waves. There's one that left in 75, and then there are some who left after 78 in a much more arduous manner. But the first wave who came, I found, and all, in my case, all arrived in one place, which is right outside of Washington, D.C. So I think, you know, I've thought a lot about this, and it feels a lot to me, because I'm trying to put myself in the position of the Americans who were already in Falls Church and in the D.C. area. What if I were to step in their shoes? What would it feel like for them, right? So I probably would say it felt like they're invaded, because there's this onslaught of people who suddenly descended into their country and their neighborhood. And kind of like reminders of a really bitter war that, very strangely, those of us who grew up in Vietnam really didn't realize the bitterness that that war generated in America. So when I came, I had no knowledge that we came with these, that we brought maybe American trauma with us. You know, like we have our own trauma, and we brought American trauma with us to Virginia. So when I was in high school, the point is that it's hard to believe, but you know, for 4 years, I really had probably no friends, and not many sympathetic teachers. Two, my English teacher, who really made me love the English novel, especially the Irish novel, and then a math teacher who sort of saved me. But I think that it was a very big trauma for me arriving in the US. And strangely, I think it was more traumatic because we were in a group, meaning, again, taking it from the perspective of the Americans who were here. I think if we had come and it was just like if we had landed in North Dakota or Wyoming, and we're the only Vietnamese refugee family, I think I would have had a different experience, like a different kind of loneliness. But because if you're just by yourself, you're just exotic. And I think that you can then be assimilated in American eyes in a much more comfortable way for Americans. But if you're in a group that arrives and sort of take over, again, I'm using terms that I'm thinking maybe from the perspective of the people who are already here, like take over the neighborhood, then there's a huge backlash, and you're not exotic anymore, right? You're somewhat of a threat. So my high school experience was a very lonely one, and I had only books. And you know, I spent all my time in libraries, and basically was very immersed in poetry, because poems were short, and I didn't have to have all the attention span for a novel. I think Northern Virginia has changed, but when I came, it was not, it was not a welcoming place.
I think I mean, it's more difficult for me to think about my mom's high school experience than it is to think about mine, just because I think I have a very numbing personality anyway. So to me, like what happened to me, whatever it was, like happened, and I'm okay with it now. But I think about, because for her, I realized that her problems came from something that's obvious, which is pretty much like racism and ignorance and just people not being kind in general. Whereas mine, I think my experience where I felt a little bit isolated, I'm very much responsible for that, because I wasn't antisocial, but I think I just didn't try hard enough to make friends. And then by the time everybody else had made their friend groups, I didn't really know what to do. And I realized like a lot of things about me were different because I had moved just when you have to start getting social, like middle school into high school. So I didn't try hard enough. And then I realized I didn't feel the same as everybody else, and not in like, oh, I'm different, like goth type of way, but more just like my sense of humor was different. Like the way I saw the world was different. Yeah, but that it wasn't. And I didn't like being in big groups. It gave me anxiety, but I always compared myself to my mom just because from such a young age, again, she would expose me to everything. So she would tell me what happened to her in high school and like details that in comparison to what I thought I was going through, I didn't think I was going through anything that was huge. So I didn't tell her. And then by the time she found out about something that happened to me that was really rough, I think a part of her, I don't know if I don't want to speak for her, but I don't think she like regretted necessarily letting people be mean to her in high school, but I think she definitely was a factor in why she didn't want me to let it go, what happened to me, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. I told her, like, I don't want to mention any specifics, but stuff that happened during 1 year, sophomore year, I just wanted to move schools and just brush it under the rug, but she insisted that we go to the principal about it. It was a lot of stuff about like sexual harassment. It didn't end up working in our favor. Things at school got a lot worse for me, so I ended up leaving, which was a good decision because after I left, I became way more myself. I found healthier relationships. I took the risk of leaving. It was better. It was a school like completely on the other side of town. But a part of me, like at the time, really hated her because I'm thinking, you know, I could have just easily done what all the other girls do at school, which is kind of just like ignore things that are being done to me, and then it wouldn't have been worse and I wouldn't have to leave. But I realized if I thought really hard about it that I wanted to make up for what had happened to her in high school, even though it came from totally different places. Like I think mine is more it's more about like girl on girl jealousy and just like, you know, especially with the times that we're living in, like things are so complicated. So kids are just mean no matter what, but especially with technology and stuff, it gets worse. And, you know, being like overly sexualized from a young age, like it all adds into how why it was hard for me. Whereas, and I can justify that, but for my mom, I can't, there's nothing in me that wants to or can think about why she had a hard time, because I don't think any of it was her fault. And because of that, I definitely, especially as I became 14, 15, 16, I felt her a lot more and I wanted to do really, really well for her. So it's hard because at first I tried to hide it. I didn't want her to think I was going through anything bad in high school. I didn't want to give her flashbacks. And then when she yanked me out of school, I hated her. And then, I mean, I loved her the whole time, but I hated her during that time. And I think that's where we found our common ground, because now that I'm looking at it, as I just turned 18, I want to make up for everything that happened to her. That was so up and down, sorry, but I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, isn't it, that the things that, because in the case of both of you who are extraordinarily gifted in lots of ways, it's often in certain years of school that it's your very gifts. It's the things that are your strengths, the things that will make you famous someday, that are the very things that many of your fellow students will torment you with. And then going through it, you feel like, you know, it is simply a burden when in fact it's, you know, your gift is lurking underneath it. So, but that's very interesting. Okay. Now, Lon, it occurred to me in some of the answers you guys have been giving, this needs its own question. Can you address the specific challenges of a hyphenated life, a hyphenated Vietnamese American parent raising an American-born child with an American father? You know, how did you try to separate the tenets of Vietnamese parenting that are universal from the ones that are viable only within the cultural cohesion of Vietnam?
I have not found an equilibrium. You know, I feel like I'm just kind of like, motherhood is like an immigrant experience to me. Like I'm just discovering new things all the time and making mistakes and not realizing what I had done. So I did start out always wanting Harlan to have a very strong sense of self, but not a strong sense of self in the American sense of the word. Because I wanted her to really be embedded in a web of relationships. And that's very important to me, the web nature of relationships. And it's hard to do that because it's easier to do that if you are raising such a child in Vietnam and have the kind of cultural normative cultural context that imparts that sense of relationship without the parent having to consciously do it, because then it may create backlash, because if the child is feeling like you alone are making me do this and none of my friends have to do this. So, you know, Bob, since you speak Vietnamese and even with 6 tones, the way a native Vietnamese does, because
I know there are 6 tones. That 6 is a little elusive, but yeah.
At least 5 you can speak. I can't do 6 tones either, but I can do 5.
I know there's a 6th one there that I'm struggling with. Yeah.
He can do the 6 tones, but I have
by the way,
learned the 6th tone.
You just brought up the answer to a question I should have asked. What is the meaning of the title of the book? And that's it. There are 6 tones. Every sound in every Vietnamese word, there are 6 different ways that you can inflect it, which can drastically change the meaning of whatever word it's sitting in. But yes.
So as I was about to say, since you speak Vietnamese, you know that the language is all relational. You can't say I. There's no such thing as an I, because you can't say I unless you're situating yourself in relation to somebody.
Right.
So I wanted to impart that to her, that she is part of a web, and that what she does, she should really think about how it affects others. Right. And not wait for the other to come and say, you did this and it has this repercussion, right? I would like her to know, to anticipate that. And I think to some extent, that's a core value for me. And I think to some extent, I might have succeeded in that, because I do notice, let's say when we were at an airport bathroom and she turns on the sink and the water splashing all over, I look back and I do see her on her own wiping that public sink, even though it's not at home. She may not do it at home, but at least she does do it in the bathroom. So I was very pleased to see those sorts of little things that shows that she understands that if you do something that affects another, you should be aware of that. So that's my main thing. The other stuff is very hard. Doing really well in school, which to me is education is as a newcomer, a refugee, I always thought education as the way out, and I always told her, and this is a misconception between us, I never wanted her to fail in high school because I think that there's no reason for her to fail in high school. She should do very well. And there are 3 basic rules, I think. It's almost like a Confucius template. If you follow this recipe, you will do well in high school or in any school. Right? Don't procrastinate, like give yourself a lot of time to do the assignment. Number 2, if the teacher assigns you to do all the odd number questions, at least is what I did, I would make sure I did all the even number questions as well. And number 3, always do extra credit because that's your insurance, right? I never count on anything like intelligence because I think I just work hard and I'm not particularly intelligent. I just work hard. And I think working hard is very important. So that's a value I want. That's a very, very kind of water buffalo, tilling the soil way of success to me. And that's a very Asian value, deferred gratification, things like that. Not being so,
But I don't
so
do
flashy.
that.
She doesn't do any of it. So that I've totally failed in that area. She doesn't accept any of that. And she thinks that I don't allow her to fail. And I have told her, it's okay to fail, but you have to fail spectacularly. Meaning, if you really want to do something, do it. And if you fail at it, it's perfectly fine. But don't fail because you forgot to turn in your homework, right? Or don't fail because you did not study for the test or you assumed you're too smart for the test. I think that kind of failure, I have not accepted that kind of failure. So when she comes home, for example, and she says, oh, I got a B, I'm thinking, why did you get a, not that a B is a failure, but she could have gotten an A if she had started the project sooner. So those are some of the main things in terms of my more refugee Asian value, you know, always having a plan B. I expect things to go wrong, and she doesn't.
What was the question?
Being dual,
Oh, yeah.
being hyphenated.
Okay.
Let's go to you now, Harlan, on that same question, because in some ways, you know, you and your mother at the end of the book reach certainly, if not a full understanding, a lot better understanding. But tell us about your challenges in arriving there. Did you come to understand the struggle that your mother had in order to reconcile these deeply ingrained parenting traditions with a new land she did not choose? Did you come to see that often the things that she tormented you about were actually intended as acts of mothering love? Or how did you come to some kind of dual interpretation or something else?
I mean, I've never thought of her as like just a torturer. So, but I think it's also like, it's hard because I can't tell if our understanding now, even though it's still rocky, if it came from writing the book, which was also kind of therapeutic, or if it just came because I got older, because this part of my life is the part that went up and down the most, like just 15, 16, 17, that naturally will cause like a totally like a 180 flip in attitude toward the world. So originally when I got the book offer, I was about to turn 16. So I kind of hated everybody already. So unfortunately, I think I treated the book, like the first draft I have, I don't even want to read it. Well, I don't want to read it because it looks like a hormonal dumping ground. Like, just like, I hate the world, I hate my mom, I hate everybody. But I mean, obviously not like that, but kind of. And over time, you know, the agent or the editors or, you know, everyone would say like, no, you have to be more optimistic. And I would be really upset when they would tell me that. But I'm very happy that I did, because over time, like throughout the 2 years, I kind of went through it and I cleaned it up just so I wouldn't regret anything that I wrote. Because that's what's scary to me, is if I had written this memoir when I was 30, 31, 32, maybe my attitudes wouldn't have changed so much. But as I wrote it, I was aware that even within like 6 months, I might totally change what I had thought about something, and I didn't want to look back and cringe on it. And it's very extra fragile, not even talking about other people that I wrote about, but my mother especially, because there are chapters in there that she didn't want in there. And it took many fights to get even like an implication of what's in there, and which I think is best anyway. I think when you write and you're not sure if it should be in there, if it shouldn't be in there, it's always best to kind of like imply the situation and then hope that the reader gets it. Not just for memoir form, but for anything, I think it sounds the best. So like for the shadow selves part, for example, I don't know if anyone here has like read that yet, but basically it alludes to like elements of PTSD. And my first page, I think my first page, it talks about feeling detached from myself, and they're both coping mechanisms where you dissociate from the world. It's not, mine obviously isn't as severe where I'm like totally detached, but for a while I numbed out. Like when as I was writing the book, for example, an event that brought us very close together was when my dad passed away. And the day that I found him, like we found him together, and I still went to school that morning. Like I found him in the morning as the sun was coming up, and I still went to school. And I didn't, like, I knew in my head, like, okay, he's dead, but it didn't really strike me until 6 months later. And then I fell into the worst depression of my life. And that was when we had to start editing the book. So this is the time, like the opportunity, those 6 months later is when you decide, like, what are you going to take out? This is the last call. Make sure you know what you want in there. Make sure you know what you don't. So that's when we would start fighting a lot, because it's like the stuff that, that hinted at PTSD is very fragile. So I understand, like, she didn't want it in there. But it really helped me understand her more. And we compromised not only on writing style, but just fighting about the book. I mean, especially with any mother, daughter, parent, child, any argument that starts, it always branches off into other things that are unrelated. And that's why arguments will go on for so long. That's why everyone feels so weighed down. So I was always grateful, though, that as I was writing and editing, the arguing that was happening during my most up and down years, it wasn't for no reason. Like all the arguing was toward a purpose, and it was to make this book. So that's something I'm super grateful for, because I don't think barely any other child-parent relationship gets that, where they can have like this end product. And of course I'm self-conscious about the book. Like I honestly haven't read my own writing or like gone back and looked at it for probably like almost a year now, because I don't like looking at anything that I do. But my mother, you know, she's very analytical. She ponders. So I'm sure she knows every inch of what she wrote. I honestly have no idea, because I wrote it during the part of numbing out. So that's the difference between the two of us. But I think the end product really bonded us. And that's like the hyphenated part to me. Again, and like, as I said before, it has nothing to do with being split between white and Asian. It's like our difference in personalities hyphens me, because I carry her with me all the time. Like her personality, I feel like, is embedded in my own, and maybe vice versa, I don't know. But so that part like definitely divides me. Did I answer?
Well,
Yeah. Go ahead, Bob.
Go ahead. I didn't realize you had more to add. That's great. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was only going to amplify what she said about the hyphenation. I feel totally hyphenated, and she already said that she feels less hyphenated. And my hyphenation is much more on the issue of Vietnam, US, East, West, refugee, American. So those hyphenation are very deeply embedded in me. And it's actually, you know, very hard to carry both. You can convince yourself and say that it's a really positive thing to have access to both worlds and to be able to parachute in and out and choose the best of both worlds. But a lot of times it's not like you're just pairing an earring with a blouse, right? Where you're saying, oh, I'll pick one of this and one of that. It's quite mixed up, you know, so that this hyphenation sounds great. It sounds like you have an expanded microcosm where you can definitely pick and choose. But that's more like a cerebral position, because in real life, they bleed into each other. and they're tangled, and it's not as if there is this 2 compartments with a bridge that you can just cross at will whenever you want to, and you can leave whenever you want to. So it does sow confusion, and I think it's not as easy as it sounds. At least it's not easy for me, and even the process of quote assimilation is not easy for me. And the book, you know, she wants to talk about her hyphenation is sort of the mental health issue that we have in the family. That's more her hyphenation than the East-West. And I only allowed it or succumbed to it because I thought maybe it will help someone else. That's one issue, you know, because in the Vietnamese community, mental health is very, it's not discussed. And it's a huge stigma. I think there are a lot of Vietnamese children in school, in fact, I don't know, I've been told this, who suffer a lot in silence. And I think their parents do as well. So as reluctant as I am and was to do this sort of thing in a memoir form, my only consolation really is sort of, it's a good thing to do. And it doesn't help me to write it, actually. So it's not therapeutic for me. I can't say that, but maybe it would help somebody else. And I think Harlan wanted it to be written, right? I mean, that was our fight. I didn't want it to be written. She wanted it to be written. And I just thought, it's not my place to silence her. And that's a very big part of our 1.5-year struggle with each other. What to write, how to write it, how much to be explicit, how to describe, how to let the reader infer. Yeah.
The two of you created a lovely conclusion to this part of the evening, and we've got some time for Q&A. And do I turn this back over to Chevalier Books?
Yes.
Part?
Sure. Just a quick note for everyone. We are entering into the Q&A. The way that we usually handle this is you could either A, drop any questions that you have into the chat box, or B, there should be a little symbol at the end or the bottom of your screen that lets you raise your hand, in which case I can call on you and I'll unmute your microphone and you can ask your questions yourself. I am going to use my privilege as host to ask the first question, and that is that I started reading the book, and as an American daughter, also a Vietnamese refugee mother, it's honestly a little bit hard for me to get through just because I end up crying almost every other page because the book is so vulnerable to the audience and to each other. And so I'm curious about how, as a mother-daughter duo, when you read each other's half of the book, was there anything that you were surprised by? Like, oh, I didn't know that she felt this way, or she never told me about this, and I didn't know that she interpreted, you know, X event. So I'm curious about that.
We read each other's stuff a lot more in the beginning because I mean, honestly, when we started reading each other's stuff, we would argue so much, and it would become like, not even to argue about the book, but it would just become malicious because I start resenting, like, you know, like the typical stuff, like, who are you to silence me? And like, I'm just as important as you are, and I should be able to write what I want. And, you know, I would say to her, like, I think you're being hypocritical because you talk about like being honest and stuff, but now when it's about you, you don't want me to say anything. And there was like a small incident where this one chapter I wrote, I had said something about her like screaming at me, and she changed the word to raising her voice, and she didn't think I would notice, but I noticed it, and it like caused such a huge problem because it wasn't even about that. But I'm thinking like, okay, so like she has a problem with admitting things. So then I start trying to like diagnose her. It becomes a whole different issue. And so reading each other's stuff, I mean, honestly, I know a lot about her life because I'm always asking her. I don't think I would know so much if I didn't ask her. So a lot of it wasn't a shock to me. I think how she felt about me, I've known for a while. The way she described me was very interesting to read. What about you?
I'm very sorry to say that I had no idea how hard it was for her in high school. And I actually only knew about it from reading it. Because I used my own indicators of my own wounds in high school to see if she had wounds, right? So my wounds were very obvious. I had no friends, I was ostracized, I ate basically in the cafeteria by myself. She was the opposite. She was so extroverted. She had the right clothes to wear. You know, I had nothing fashionable to wear. So if you juxtapose that, and that's the lens I used. So it just felt like she was very integrated. And it turned out that there was this whole thick layers of sexual harassment going on that was so shocking to me that I was absolutely in shock when I found out what happened. And I said, we have to go to the principal and you have to leave the school. Because we had no, a lot of this was on social media, Snapchat or something, they disappeared. So it's not like you could have the proof, but that was extremely shocking to me to find out about it in the book and then having to go also to deal with it with the principal, right?
Okay, so we do have a few questions in the chat room now that I want to share. The very first one is from Lisa Bloom, and she asks, how did you find the courage to write this? I can't imagine being so honest and real in a book with either my mom or daughter.
I mean, it's so funny because I think my fear was having her read my stuff. It didn't even occur to me like, oh, the world's gonna read it, because I've always, like, for example, in January of this year, when someone mentioned something at the end of the year, like October, November, I'm like, oh, that time of year is not even gonna come. Like, I don't even write it down, the event that's gonna happen, because it's so far away. It might as well be like 500 years. So when we're talking about like publishing a book, I would talk about it since I was little, like, oh, I'll be a writer. But she was way more conscious about the audience, and that's why she was scared. Whereas I think I'm more nervous about my own changes. Like, it was a more internal worry. Like, as I said, like, am I gonna totally change my mind on this in a year and then regret everything that I said, which would be super embarrassing for me? Is this gonna hurt my relationship with my mom even more than I was already like feeling at the time? So that's my worry. But I think like as I grew up and more stuff in our relationship was revealed to each other through writing the book, which actually I think ironically brought out more courage in me. And then also my dad leaving halfway, like right at the halfway mark of writing it, gave me like a final shove. Like, I have to do it now, because before he died, the last thing he knew that I was doing was doing this. So it was like a very big push.
Lisa, I did not want to do it, and I did it actually because, and I'm sure you remember saying this, when Harlan said to me, I don't respect you for not wanting to write this. And I'm thinking, well, I mean, she was 15 or 15 and a half. And I thought, well, you don't have the depth of experience in life yet to know what all of it involves. But that statement really upset me. Because it was like, it was not said in the middle of a fight. It was said very calmly. So I thought, well, okay, well, what can be worse if your kid thinks you're duplicitous and it's a coward. I'll do it. So then it became an issue of what should we write about? Because obviously, just by virtue of length and page limits, you can't write about everything. And I don't want the book to be just about one note. I want it to be about this entire bundle of, to me, things that still turn me inside out are war and trauma stuff. So that's what I want the book really to be mostly about, now that she has pushed it in that direction.
Well, I'm very happy that for individual reasons, you both ended up writing the book. We do have a question, a very specific question from a Bernard Adams asking, Lan, have you heard the final audiobook version yet?
I just went on Amazon to start downloading it, but I've been in touch with the two narrators who are so great, and I'm very eager to listen to it.
I'm so scared to listen to it.
It was at your studio, right, Bernard? Yeah, yes.
This is also a very specific question. This one, let's see, from Manger, a question for Harlan. How much do you know your maternal grandpa, General Carl von Bien?
How much do I know him? He died around the time I was 6, which is really crazy because that's when I went to Vietnam for the first time. So maybe that's a sign. He was very, it's so hard because, when like someone that significant dies so early, you're so young, like you don't have the time to appreciate them. So then when you're older, like you regret not knowing them more, even though it was totally out of your control. And regretting something that was totally out of your control is the worst feeling. So I know like we'd go every other weekend sometimes to visit him. He was in a nursing home because he needed so much care because his health was pretty rough. I would always, a very bad like blood transfusion that totally screwed up his body. So I went every few weekends. I'd play the violin for him. My mom always told me like, I think he loves you more than he loves me. I don't know why she would say that, but he, it's very shocking to me how similar he was to my father because they both have such kind eyes. Like I've never seen, for people who've been through so much, I've never seen a look of anger. Maybe it's just because I was so little, I didn't have enough time to see it, but I've never seen anything other than like generosity and optimism toward the world, despite everything, despite having such a dramatic time. I remember like scattering his ashes more than I do actually meeting him, which is really sad. But again, I was really small. I have so many pictures with him. And they look the same. My mom, in my opinion, they have the same face. So I never forget about him. I didn't know him that well though.
Got it. So surprisingly, we don't have that many questions in the chat. We do have a lot of really sweet comments. But I'm going to go ahead and lead us out with a question then that I'm rather curious about, which is that, Harlan, would you consider yourself a writer now? Is that the aspiration that's on the table? And Lan, would you want her to be a writer moving forward?
I've always wanted to do something in movies. So I would like to write movies because movies, like the script, it's just like dialogue, and I've always preferred dialogue because I hate describing things, like descriptions and stuff, because that's so creative, whereas like dialogue is so like to the point. So if I remember something, if I'm doing something based on my own life and I remember it happening that way, then I just write it down. I don't have to like think like, oh, that sucked because I can't write. Whereas like with my descriptions, I am really terrified to go back and read it. So directing is like taking the dialogue and then putting it on screen. So I guess I'd like to write movies. Penguin, the publisher, they like have said, they've hinted at like if I want to do something by myself, like they're open to helping me with that. So that would be really cool. it's so hard to tell if I'm a writer because obviously, like, objectively, like, I wrote a book, so I guess I'm a writer, but it's so different from what I was expecting growing up when I would always say I wanted to be a writer, because it's literally like a diary, but it's like a therapy version of a diary that everyone gets to read that all goes toward one theme of like the hardest part of my life, which is my mom. So it's very, but like in a good way. Like everything I say comes out weird. Yeah, what about you?
Well, I love writing myself, even though it's very arduous. It's not like a pleasant process for me. But what I love about writing is that, you know, when you're starting a project, it's like falling in love for the first time, you know, with the project that you're embarking on, even with all of the difficulties. Because to be a writer, I think you have to really notice things. And imagine, you know, if you go into the doctor's office and you're waiting, and it could just be really boring. If I were writing at that moment, it wouldn't be boring to me at all, right? Because I would be noticing all my senses, my sense of touch, sight, smell, would be totally intense because I'm absorbing the world. And it's sort of like everything is new. Even a routine is new because you're absorbing it to write. Your senses are very alive. And it's like, you know, even if you, let's say you're eating eggs. This is a weird analogy, but I started it, so I have to finish. You're eating eggs and you eat it every morning. It's just fried eggs, nothing, no big deal. But let's say you eat those same eggs with somebody you're crazy about. It's suddenly now a very different and very intense experience. And that's what I feel like when I'm writing, because everything is intense. And it's hard to sustain that intensity in everyday life. So when you're writing, you have that intensity. And I think if she were to be a writer and to just be out there absorbing the world, looking at the world, embracing the world, everything is interesting. And that is inside you, right? You don't need another person to provide that for you. You can do it yourself because you're sparked now. There's a catalyst inside of you. And there's a fire in you to write. And I think that's just wonderful. And that's my relationship with writing. Even when I have blocks, I keep going there because it's the only place that I can really explore really unruly stuff that I don't explore in the you know, in sort of the professional world. So only in writing do I explore it. And actually the only other place to explore it is in therapy. So the two are very similar. And since we've been talking about trauma, I do want to say how, you know, therapy and writing have been crucial for me. So, you know, my first acknowledgement in my book are to my therapists, whom are just absolutely special to me. And I don't want to keep going, but it's a relationship and there's nothing like it.
It's really lovely. And I'm curious because we have Robert here too on this topic of a philosophy behind writing. Is there anything you would like to share with us about the wonders of writing?
Well, the thing that is at the center of fiction is what's at the heart of our moment-to-moment existence. What's at the heart of telling stories is that you have a character who yearns for something. Yearning is the central principle that I work with in teaching writing. That all stories are about someone who yearns for something, and then that yearning is challenged and thwarted, and the attempts to get around that or through it, you know, provides the narrative flow. And I have come to understand in literary fiction, which is what, you know, Lon and I write, is that I think that there's a unified field theory of yearning. And that is that if you look deep enough into all great literature, the central character yearns for a self, for an identity, for a place in the universe. And that's the essential question of our existence in this, on the planet, in these bodies, and with these innate other mysterious things kicking around in us. So for me, the act of creating books, novels, and books of stories has to do with living deeply and with and inhabiting characters who are living or showing the depths of their yearning for a self, for an identity. And it's what it's all about.
That's amazing. I think that's a great way to end this evening. We had an hour of magical and illuminating conversation. I want to thank Robert, Lan, and Harlan for sharing their time with us tonight, and everyone here for sharing the hour with us as well. In my few months of experiencing and hosting these events online for the bookstore, I can say pretty confidently that I've never seen this much love and support in the audience. The chat room is filled with loving comments for the three of you. I'll definitely forward this to you, because if you ever need to feel better, these comments is where it's at. For the audience, I want to let you know that I have dropped a link in the chat box again if you want to buy a copy of Family in Six Tones online to support Shivali's books, and of course the authors as well. And if you'd like to reserve a signed copy, go ahead and email us at shivalisbooks@gmail.com. I do want to share one of these comments with you as we're rolling out here from Elise. It's a really wonderful comment, and I second it. She writes, I want to thank Lan and Harlan so much for writing about mental health, because as she said, it's not really discussed in the Vietnamese community, even though it needs to be. The trauma suffered by refugees becomes intergenerational, and it's heartbreaking how everyone suffers in silence. Thank you for bringing light to it and removing the stigma. And I 100% agree. Again, thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate seeing all of you, and it's been really meaningful to see you here. The book was very raw for us, and I really so much appreciate your support, especially as we're journeying forth into a very strange world on top of everything else. Your presence has meant everything to us. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone.